Federal files were filling up fast. Wiretaps, surveillance photos, financial trails that pointed to one rising figure in Harlem's underworld, Frank Lucas. To the outside world, the picture looked clear. A new boss, bigger operations, louder money, a target the FBI could finally measure. But inside those files, something didn't line up. Again and again, agents ran into the same problem. Not evidence, hesitation, not confusion, caution. Because alongside Frank Lucas's name, another name kept appearing in conversations, behaviors, and assumptions. A name tied to a man who was no longer alive, yet still shaping how everyone moved. That name was Bumpy Johnson. The FBI knew Lucas was powerful. They could see it in the scale of the operation, the boldness of the roots, the money changing hands. But power like that was familiar. It could be mapped, pressured, eventually dismantled. What unsettled them was something else entirely. The realization that Harlem was still operating according to rules set by someone who was gone. Informants spoke carefully. Rivals hesitated. Even Lucas himself seemed to be navigating an invisible boundary, as if certain lines still couldn't be crossed. That told investigators everything they needed to know. Frank Lucas was running an empire, but he wasn't defining the system. In 1969, the FBI faced an uncomfortable truth. The most influential force in Harlem's underworld wasn't the man at the top of the supply chain. It was the legacy that dictated how that chain was allowed to exist. And that's why, despite all of Frank Lucas's power, the Bureau feared one name more, a name that no longer needed to act to be obeyed. From the FBI's perspective in 1969, Frank Lucas looked like a familiar problem, the kind agents had learned to chart, pressure, and eventually break. His operation left numbers behind. Shipments had volume, routes had names. Money moved in patterns that could be traced. This was visible power, loud enough to draw attention, structured enough to be mapped. Lucas didn't hide his rise. He expanded aggressively, betting on scale to protect him. Bigger supply meant more leverage. More leverage meant fewer challengers. To investigators, that kind of confidence was both dangerous and useful. Dangerous because it spread fast. Useful because it created edges, places where pressure could be applied. On paper, Lucas was exactly the kind of figure federal law enforcement was built to confront. But what the Bureau noticed almost immediately was the contrast between how big Lucas was and how cautiously everyone around him behaved. In other cities, a new boss at that scale would trigger chaos, challenges, splinter groups, reckless moves as rivals tested the limits. In Harlem, that didn't happen. The expansion was bold, but the environment stayed restrained. That discrepancy raised questions. Informants didn't speak with the urgency agents expected. Rivals didn't overreact. Street-level players still referenced old boundaries, old understandings, as if there were lines that even Lucas wasn't supposed to cross. From an investigative standpoint, that was unusual. Systems don't usually keep their discipline when leadership changes. It suggested that Lucas's power, while real, was conditional. He controlled supply and money, but he hadn't redefined behavior. He hadn't rewritten the social logic of the neighborhood. People complied with him, but they didn't reorganize themselves around him the way they once had around someone else. That distinction mattered, because power that relies on enforcement looks different from power that shapes norms. The FBI could see where Lucas was strong. What unsettled them was where he wasn't. His authority produced activity, not alignment. It generated movement, not loyalty. And for agents who studied long-term criminal structures, that was a warning sign. Not about Lucas's weakness, but about what still held the system together beneath him. Frank Lucas was powerful, but he was powerful in ways the Bureau understood. What they hadn't yet fully measured was the quieter force still setting limits on that power. A force that didn't appear in shipment logs or wiretaps, but showed up in how carefully everyone continued to move. As agents dug deeper, a pattern kept resurfacing, not in the numbers, but in the language. During interviews, in offhand remarks, and in the pauses between answers, people referenced an older order without naming it directly. Decisions were justified by how things had always been done. Certain moves were avoided, not because Frank Lucas forbade them, but because they violated a memory of restraint that predated him. That memory had a name. Bumpy Johnson no longer needed to be present to be enforced. His influence appeared as a set of boundaries everyone seemed to know instinctively. Informants described rules without citing an enforcer. Rivals explained hesitation without pointing to a threat. Even those benefiting from Lucas's expansion spoke as if there were lines that shouldn't be crossed. Lines that didn't belong to Lucas to redraw. For the FBI, this was the tell. Criminal power usually consolidates by replacing norms. New leadership rewrites expectations. Old limits get tested, then erased. But Harlem didn't behave that way. The city absorbed Lucas's rise without abandoning the older framework that governed behavior. Expansion happened, yes, but within invisible rails. That's when agents understood the difference between operational power and normative power. Lucas controlled operations. He could move product, reward loyalty, punish defiance. But normative power, the kind that decides what counts as acceptable, was still anchored elsewhere. It lived in a legacy that shaped risk assessment long after the man himself was gone. This distinction mattered because it changed how the Bureau interpreted resistance and compliance. When people followed Lucas's orders, they were complying. When they limited themselves without being told, they were obeying something deeper. And deeper forces are harder to dislodge than any individual. The files began to reflect this tension. Agents noted bold logistics paired with conservative behavior. Big moves executed carefully. Growth without chaos. It was as if the system had accepted a new operator but refused a new philosophy. That's why the name kept surfacing, not as nostalgia, but as constraint. A reference point that explained why Harlem didn't spiral the way other markets did under rapid expansion. The FBI wasn't just tracking a trafficker anymore. They were tracking a living boundary, one that continued to regulate behavior without issuing commands. By the end of 1969, it was clear. Lucas had power, but he didn't own the limits. And in criminal ecosystems, the force that owns the limits is the one the state has to understand first. Because dismantling operations is easier than dismantling the rules everyone still believes in. From an enforcement standpoint, Frank Lucas was a problem with edges. He could be pressured. He could be isolated. His routes could be disrupted. His finances stressed. His lieutenants flipped. That kind of power, however large, follows rules the FBI understands. It reacts, it adapts, and eventually, it makes mistakes. What unsettled agents wasn't Lucas's reach. It was the absence of disorder that usually follows a rapid rise like his. Harlem didn't splinter. It didn't erupt into open competition. It didn't broadcast weakness. Instead, behavior stayed disciplined, as if an unseen referee still existed. For the Bureau, that was the red flag. Criminal systems typically show strain when leadership changes. Norms loosen. Violence spikes. Opportunists test boundaries. None of that happened at the scale expected. That pointed to a different center of gravity. Bumpy Johnson represented something Lucas did not: a completed authority. Not operational control, but legitimacy inside the ecosystem. Bumpy's power had never depended on constant enforcement. It depended on shared understanding. People knew what was acceptable because it had been defined over time, and definitions persist longer than enforcers. The FBI feared that more than Lucas because ghosts don't make mistakes. A living trafficker can be baited. A legacy cannot. When rules are internalized, they don't require communication. They don't generate wiretaps. They don't create paper trails. They simply shape decisions before decisions become evidence. That's a nightmare for enforcement because it reduces exposure without reducing activity. Agents began to see that taking down Lucas would not automatically dismantle the underlying discipline. Another operator could step in and inherit the same rails. The system would keep functioning because its limits weren't being actively imposed. They were being remembered. That's why files reflected caution rather than urgency. The Bureau wasn't afraid of Lucas's power to act. They were wary of the power that didn't need to act at all, the kind that survives arrests, trials, and headlines because it exists as expectation. In practical terms, this changed strategy. Investigations slowed. Pressure was applied indirectly. The goal wasn't a quick takedown that left norms intact. It was understanding how to break the norms themselves. And that required patience, not force. By late 1969, the conclusion was clear inside the Bureau. Frank Lucas was the visible threat. But the deeper risk, the one that determined how Harlem absorbed pressure, was the lingering authority of a name that still organized behavior. That was the fear. Not of what Lucas would do next, but of how smoothly the system could continue, no matter who sat at the top. Inheritance in criminal systems is rarely clean. Assets can be passed. Roots can be reused. People can be promoted. But authority doesn't move the same way. It has to be accepted. And acceptance follows memory, not money. That distinction is where the FBI saw the gap between Frank Lucas and the shadow he was operating under. Lucas inherited infrastructure. He did not inherit permission. Agents noticed it in the small choices. Lucas expanded aggressively, but he also over-signaled. He displayed wealth. He emphasized scale. He needed visibility to confirm position. That told the Bureau something important. He was still asserting power, not assuming it. Assertion is noisy. It invites measurement, and measurement is where enforcement lives. The older order had been different. Bumpy Johnson never needed to prove reach in public. His authority had been internalized. People didn't wait for instructions. They anticipated them. When power reaches that stage, it becomes efficient and dangerously quiet. Lucas, by contrast, had to keep reminding the environment who was in charge. That difference shaped behavior around him. Rivals complied, but they watched. Associates followed, but they hedged. The ecosystem moved, but it didn't reorganize itself around Lucas the way it once had around Bumpy. For the FBI, that meant leverage still existed. The system hadn't fully recalibrated. This partial transfer mattered because it limited how resilient Lucas's operation could be under pressure. If the rules aren't deeply owned, stress produces errors. People defect earlier. Messages leak. Lines blur. A system that relies on reminders fractures faster than one that relies on belief. Agents began framing Lucas not as the final form of Harlem's underworld, but as a transitional figure. Powerful, dangerous, but still constrained by norms he didn't set. He was operating inside rails he hadn't laid down, and that made his dominance brittle. He could expand volume, but he couldn't safely expand behavior. That's why the Bureau slowed certain moves. They weren't waiting for Lucas to peak. They were waiting to see whether the inheritance would ever complete. Would Harlem accept new rules? Or would it keep enforcing old ones despite new leadership? The answer would determine whether a takedown would trigger chaos or clarity. By the end of 1969, the signal was consistent. Power had been inherited, but authority had not fully transferred. Lucas was strong, but the system still referenced something older when deciding what not to do. And for investigators, that meant the deepest constraint on the operation wasn't fear of the law. It was loyalty to a standard that predated the man now at the top. That gap was the opening, not for spectacle but for strategy. By late 1969, the FBI wasn't debating whether Frank Lucas was dangerous. That question had been settled. What they were debating was timing, and timing hinged on something they couldn't subpoena or wiretap, a shadow that still regulated behavior. Every pressure test produced the same result. Routes adjusted but didn't panic. Associates complied but didn't scatter. Rivals waited but didn't rush in. The system absorbed stress without changing its character. For investigators, that meant one thing. The underlying rules were still holding. Those rules traced back to Bumpy Johnson. The Bureau feared that moving too fast against Lucas would leave those rules intact. A headline arrest could remove a man while preserving the discipline that made replacement easy. Another operator would step in, inherit the same rails, and the market would stabilize again. Quieter, smarter, and harder to penetrate. So the FBI slowed down. They watched how Lucas handled moments when the old code conflicted with his ambitions. They tracked whether associates chose growth or restraint when pushed. They measured not just activity, but hesitation, the places where expansion stopped short for reasons no one would explain out loud. That hesitation was the signal. It told the Bureau the shadow still mattered. Investigators understood that shadows don't disappear when you arrest someone. They fade only when behavior stops referencing them. Until then, enforcement has to decide whether it's dismantling a man or challenging a memory. One is straightforward, the other is a long game. That's why the FBI feared the name more than the person. Lucas could be isolated, pressured, eventually cornered. But the legacy that shaped how Harlem absorbed pressure required a different approach, one that waited for norms to loosen before force was applied. By the end of the year, the strategy was clear. Don't rush a takedown that leaves the code untouched. Let ambition strain the old boundaries. Let contradictions surface. Let the shadow weaken on its own. Only then would action matter. In that sense, the FBI's fear wasn't of power at its peak. It was of power that had already proven it could outlive the people who carried it. And until that was addressed, even the most powerful new boss was just operating inside someone else's rules. Rules the Bureau knew it had to break before any victory would last. By the end of 1969, the FBI had reached an uncomfortable conclusion. The most powerful figure on the street wasn't the one moving the most product or generating the most cash. Frank Lucas was dangerous, visible, and expanding, but he was also legible. His power could be tracked, stressed, and eventually dismantled. What couldn't be dismantled so easily was a standard. Bumpy Johnson no longer needed to act to be obeyed. His authority had crossed a threshold where it existed as memory, habit, and expectation. It shaped decisions before decisions became evidence. It limited behavior without issuing commands. And that is the kind of power enforcement learns to fear, not because it's loud, but because it's durable. This is why the Bureau moved carefully, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition. Taking down a man is one thing. Taking down the rules everyone still believes in is another. Until those rules loosen, pressure only reshapes the surface. In the end, the story of 1969 isn't about the rise of a new boss. It's about the afterlife of authority. About how systems can be governed by someone who isn't there, and how that absence can be more controlling than presence ever was. Power that relies on force leaves trails. Power that relies on belief leaves boundaries. And as long as those boundaries held, the FBI knew one thing for certain. The most influential name in Harlem didn't belong to the man at the top of the operation. It belonged to the one who had already defined how power was allowed to exist.